In the last line of this gospel passage, this is Luke chapter 19, verses 41 to 44. Jesus says, speaking of the people of Jerusalem, and not just Jerusalem, but all the Jewish people, the Israel, the nation, and the faith of Israel and the Jewish faith, you did not recognize the time of your visitation, that they, at the time, most of them were not able to recognize that Christ was, in fact, God coming to them. And he weeps for them. So there's not scorn, there's not anger, there's a weeping, a sadness on his part that people could not recognize what God was doing for them through him. Another way to consider this phrase of people not recognizing the time of God's visitation is calling us to ask God to help us be alert for when God comes to us through others, and especially through those who are less fortunate than we are, those who struggle, those, and the thing with God, it doesn't matter whether it's through no fault of their own or through their own fault, or some mixture of both. So how fitting it is for us to have this reading, which is just for the regular weekday, to line up with our feast day of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, because she recognized God's visitation to her in the poor of the land that her husband, Ludwig of Thuringia, the poor, the sick, the struggling. And so she is known, and I'm sure most of you know this, but if you don't, she is known for having cared for them, the poor, in the realm that her husband oversaw. A priest who was her spiritual director wrote about her life, and that's been partly preserved in the Liturgy of the Hours, this collection of prayers and readings and psalms and the like that many people pray around the world and have done for centuries. So out of the, I'm sure, well, maybe thousands, I guess, certainly hundreds of saints who are in the Liturgy of the Hours and have readings about them. Just yesterday, I realized part of God's ironic sense of humor of having me assigned here to St. Elizabeth of Hungary, because from year to year, I forget who this is until now. I have to say, there are probably millions of words in the Liturgy of the Hours. I'm sure if you counted them up. And among them, one of my absolute favorite line from the Liturgy of the Hours happens to be about St. Elizabeth of Hungary. But I mean literally. But I had forgotten that until yesterday when I was here. So this is part of his letter about her. This is from Conrad of Marburg, who was St. Elizabeth's spiritual director. And I believe this is speaking of after her husband had died, and she had discretion to use their riches the way she wanted, and some of her in-laws or whatever else, people on her husband's side of the family apparently were not too crazy about her using it for things like caring for the poor and that sort of thing. So he writes this: from this time onward, Elizabeth's goodness greatly increased. She was a lifelong friend of the poor and gave herself entirely to relieving the hungry. She ordered that one of her castles should be converted into a hospital in which she gathered many of the weak and feeble. And that is one of my absolute favorite lines in the entire Liturgy of the Hours. One of her castles. You're kidding me, right? One of her castles. So, Elizabeth, St. Elizabeth, dear sister in Christ, those are the kind of things that can make us feel like, oh, the saints, they're way up there somewhere. They're lofty. They're rich and noble people. Obviously not all saints were like that. But when you read something like that, she ordered that one of her castles be converted into a hospital. But the lesson in that is she used what she had. She gave over the circumstances of her life. She was born of Andrew, the king of Hungary, so she's a princess. She's born the daughter of a king, and then she marries a nobleman, Louis or Ludwig of Thuringia, and they had 3 children. She was alive in the same time as St. Francis of Assisi, and once her husband died, she joined what was very early on, the Third Order Franciscans. And she died in the year 1231, just 4 or 5 years after St. Francis of Assisi died. And God bless her, she was only 24 years old when she died. But she is an example for us because, she had more than one castle, but she took one of them and converted it, and then she visited a lot. But the thing for us to draw from that is she used what she had for the good of others and to serve God. She is a patron saint, among other things, of charities and Catholic charities, of homeless people, of hospitals, of widows. She was a woman of mercy. One thing I will say, because by the way, I'm recording this to make a bonus episode on the podcast. Many of you may not know the story of the miracle of the bread, which is why bread and roses are part of her iconography. But I will say I've read one version of this that seems to give her husband a bad rap, because what I'm reading, a couple places, including Conrad of Marburg's letter about St. Elizabeth, is that her husband was gladly approved of her charitable works, actually, and was fine. But was other parts of his family that weren't so crazy about it. But one of the descriptions says that because her husband's family, I gather, disapproved of some of her charitable works, she would take bread from the castles to give to the poor, but didn't want the family to know about it. So she was sneaking them out. So one of the biographies I read says this: one of her greatest known miracles occurred when she was still alive, the miracle of roses. It is said that during one of her many trips delivering bread to the poor in secret, her husband met her, and he wanted to make it clear to her family that she was not stealing treasures from the castle and from their riches. So this says, he asked her questions to erase everyone's suspicions that she was stealing treasures from the castle. He asked her to reveal the contents under her cloak, and as she did, instead of the bread that she had hidden under her cloak, what appeared were white and red roses. So even if it wasn't riches, but it was just bread, still some of the branch of the family, I guess, would have even objected to her taking bread to the poor. And God spared her the shame, I suppose, by making the bread turn into roses. To Ludwig, or Louis, the husband, this meant that God's protection was evident. After her death, miraculous healings began to occur at her graveside near her hospital, and she died, as I say, in 1231, and it only took 4 years. In the year 1235, the Pope at the time, Pope Gregory IX, canonized her with enough recognition of acclamation and miracles. And because of the miracle of bread, she is also patron saint of bakers. Let us ask St. Elizabeth to pray with us and for us, that we might recognize the visitation of Christ to us in the poor, the needy, the struggling, the sick, and like her, do what we can with what we've got to serve God by serving others.